Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honor to stand and respond to Bill 19, Protected Areas of British Columbia Amendment Act, and to have the opportunity to actually share some things that have been going through my mind with respect to places, names of places and place names. You know, I've stood in this House on a regular basis, and I've spoke Saanich language, Senchothan. And I have, as I've been learning the language in a very, very limited fashion, I've been applying many of the place names that have been traditionally attached to locations throughout the Saanich territory, which is, in essence, the territory that I represent with this seat, with this table in Saanich North and the Islands. It's essentially Saanich territory. Lots of the southern Gulf Islands, many places around the Saanich Peninsula all had important names attached to them in the Senchothan language. It's interesting listening to the previous speakers talk to and in going through the bill to understand how we name things today. And in many instances, in fact, in most instances, the names that we attach to places reference human beings. It's Blanchard Street. Well, Blanchard was a person. Or it's Tweedsmuir Park. That's a person. It's Roderick Haig Brown Park. These are people in our history. And if you look at how the Saanich people named the places within the territory, it was very much named after resource activities, economic development at that time, commercial opportunities. They were the names of the resources that could be harvested from those places. And in some cases, they were the names of the resources and at the time of the year that you could be there. The names were warnings. This is a place which the tide changes quickly, or this is a place where there is strong rapids. These are warnings to people to navigate through areas with care. And so there is a clash not only in culture, in modern culture today, as we look and as Indigenous people look out to their territories and see a whole pile of foreign names associated with locations throughout their territories that once had very important names to them. It's nice to see the government taking the action to move back to finding or renaming, reattaching old names to places, the names that Indigenous people had already placed there for perhaps countless generations in the past. I've often said when I was on municipal council, and in fact talked to municipal councillors in my current role as the MLA and suggested to them that an important step, just as I stood in this place and talked about the Indigenous language revitalization investment that the government has made, that as an important part of reconciliation, that also reattaching Indigenous names, the names of Indigenous places, the Indigenous names to those places, is also a critical and important step in reconciliation. It's reattaching us to the history that has existed here for much longer than British Columbia has existed. And we often talk in government about the challenges that overlapping territories create. And of course, in the colonial context, or in the context of this country as we see it now, conflict has marked our history. And of course, the conflict around overlapping territories is a big challenge with respect to the Indian Act, and as we go forward in time, it's often been something that's been used to to confuse, and as well to delay and deflect. I think that if you take a look at Indigenous cultures and the place names, you'll see that there is very clear places where one territory starts to melt into another territory. Those are the places where there carries two names, a name from one people and a name from another people. And in almost all instances, you'll start to see territories blend into each other, and one territory will eventually end. There was lots of politics in those areas. Let's just be real. There was lots of conflict in those areas. And there was also ways in which those people were able to sort that out. So I think that as we go through our ridings and we take a look at our ridings and we embrace the future of reconciliation in our province and in our country, that reattaching place names is going to have a tremendous impact in acknowledging where we've come from. And it will help us pave a way as to where we intend to go as well. So I think that it's important also to acknowledge in this debate, as we're expanding park territory and acknowledging some parks with Indigenous names, the inherent conflict that there has been in conversations that I've had around the idea of a park. Many Indigenous cultures, and I don't speak for any Indigenous culture outside of the one that I know in my limited knowledge of my own culture, is that a park doesn't exist in the context or in the worldview. There are places that are set aside for protection so that the rest of existence can be decimated and destroyed. There is an entirely different worldview. I introduced that, and I've been introducing it as I've had these discussions. And I think that this is an important time, not to diminish the fact that we have a different way of doing things in modern times and protecting certain areas so that then other areas can be exploited in their entirety. But it is important to point out that I think that as we have a discussion around creating a resilient and sustainable economy and relationship with our natural environment, that we do so by adopting some of the core principles and values of Indigenous cultures in this province. That we start to change the relationship that we have with, as the member from Nanaimo was talking about, the wilderness. If I was to sit and have a conversation with my Uncle Stalkwith, and I haven't done this, but I can imagine that from his perspective, none of the wilderness is actually either wild or empty. And I think we look at wilderness as being an empty place because we view this every place in this planet in the context of where humans are and where humans are not. And from what I'm learning in the context of Indigenous cultures, and as we're starting to put Indigenous place names on top of protected areas, I think that this is an important opportunity to point this out. That we can actually take it a step further than the distance that we're willing to go at this stage, and we can start to push the limits and maybe start to adopt some of the principles and values and the worldviews of the Indigenous cultures of our province, and they will help us create not only sustainable relationships with our environment, but also sustainable relationships with our economies, our resource extraction areas. Many of the place names, as I mentioned earlier, in our territory locate very, very important resource extraction areas that fueled trade, that made certain families powerful, very powerful in fact, dominating very large territories. And so I think that it's important to note that the current resource extraction of our province and exploitation of resources, resource development, adding value, all of that has been going on in our province for a very long time. And if we paused and took a few minutes to listen to the Indigenous place names of our province, we'd start to understand it with a different visual, a different layer, and different context. So as we acknowledge these protected areas with Indigenous names, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that that this is not the kind of perspective that I know that we have in Saanich. The entire territory is personified. Each of the living beings, even the islands, which we wouldn't in modern times consider to be living, we have put names around them and called them our relatives. And so I think that it's been an honor to have the opportunity to share that perspective in here today, and I think that it would do our province well, and it certainly would not hold us back to start to engage the world around us in a different way. And if I may, I'd just like to put a plug. As the government for my riding, Saanich, for Saanich North and the Islands, as the government has been expanding parks, there's a very lovely park on Pender Island with which they've had to put a emergency road through because of past development practices that didn't allow an egress route. And so I would just like to put it to the government today that if they want to continue to expand parkland, and I would be very, very supportive of them doing that, I would say that Lively Peak Park in Pender Island would be a great example of a park with which they could expand. And I'm certain that the people of Pender Island would also love to have a discussion about putting an Indigenous name on that park as well. So maybe in round 2 of this exciting activity of expanding parks and acknowledging Indigenous territories, Lively Peak on Pender Island, and I know that some members of government even spend some time in the summer there, so they might even know exactly where that is. So I'll take my seat today, and I just want to, at this time, and I'd just like to thank the government for the opportunity to have a conversation about place names and the importance of place names and reattaching Indigenous names to our important and protected areas. So at this time, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak to this bill.